So, when last we left our heroes, we finished up the book of Deuteronomy. And so what I wanted to do is just take a moment to kind of back up and look at Pentateuch as a whole. It's something I don't think we do a lot, is just take a minute to look at larger sections of the text and kind of look at how those come together. And some of you know that in my previous life as an academic, my area of focus was I was a canonical scholar. What that means is I tend to look at texts as a whole. I tend to look at the book of Psalms as a book. I tend to look at, to read them as they sit in their canonical placement. And so I think it's helpful to kind of take some time and just take a maybe even 30,000-foot view and look at these sections. And I want to do that with the Torah, because I thought that would be a good thing to do. But before we get going, are there any questions you guys want to have answered, or things we want to talk about, things we can deal with? I'm just so thorough previously. What questions could there possibly be? I understand. Well, some of this is going to be repeat, but some of it I think it's helpful to repeat, because not everybody was here for all of it. The word Torah, I've got the Hebrew for you there, often translated law, which I've shared before is not my favorite translation of that word. I far prefer the word instruction. It actually does come from a Hebrew verbal root, which means teaching. And so the teachings or instruction, I think, is a much better translation of this. These are ways in which, this is the law, yes, but it's the way in which you should live, the teaching, the instruction of God, and how we should go. Also called the Pentateuch, which of course means 5 books. When we talk about Torah, we mean Genesis, Deuteronomy. So capital T, Torah, Genesis, Deuteronomy. Little t sometimes referring to those individual Torah laws that you find, those instructions that you get there. But typically thought of as a Pentateuch. I do have 2 scholars here who were outliers. They were contemporaries, did most of their work in the 50s and 60s. Gerhard von Rad, he liked to talk about a hexateuch more than he wanted to talk about a Pentateuch. He includes Joshua in that story, because for von Rad, he felt that the story didn't end until they took the land. And so he wanted to have a complete story, no cliffhangers. He wanted it to come all the way to the end, and so he talked about a hexateuch. Martin Note talked about a tetrateuch. He stopped at Numbers. He felt that Deuteronomy better fit what came after it, that it introduced what we call the Deuteronomic history, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. And so that Deuteronomy fit with that bunch better than it fit as a conclusion. I said when we looked at Deuteronomy that Deuteronomy is a great pivot book, that it does 2 things well. It sums up what went before really, really well, and it introduces what comes after really, really well. And so I have no problems talking about Pentateuch is the canonical convention. I tend to be one who likes to accept what the text gives me on this, and so it's what we have, it's what I will call it. But there were some individuals who like to do things a little differently, as there always are. And I thought worth mentioning, worth at least knowing about these other ways of reading it. So, thoughts on that? This will be one of those quiet nights, isn't it? Tyler's gone, so he's got any questions. Short. All right. It is part of what is sometimes called the primary history. Now, don't confuse that with primeval history. We talked about primeval history when we were looking at Genesis. The primeval history is Genesis 1 to 11. The primary history goes Genesis to 2 Kings. So this will be a really good time to remind you that the Jewish canon order is different than the Protestant or Catholic canon order. And so in the Hebrew canon, it's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. That's fine. Joshua, Judges, 1 and 2 Samuel, 1 and 2 Kings. So Ruth is actually located in the writings in the Hebrew canon. It doesn't come back at the beginning. 2 Chronicles is also in the writing. 1 and 2 Chronicles are also in the writings. So that's worth noting. So it just goes Genesis to 2 Kings with no Ruth when I say primary history there. I fall back. My brain defaults to the Hebrew canon. I've done it so long. So if I forget Ruth or put Ruth someplace else or Esther someplace else, that's why.
Is there a reason for that?
The Christian convention was to follow the Greek translation, the Septuagint, which has it back in the beginning. The Hebrew canon, when it came together, was ordered differently.
It had nothing to do with interpretation or anything? Okay.
No. It might, and I wonder how much of it's true, it might have had something to do with the eventual Jewish rejection of the Greek translation. The Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, plus some extra books that the Catholics have as canonical, the Deuterocanonicals, Maccabees, and Ecclesiasticus, etc. That the Septuagint was embraced by Christians. It was a great missionary Bible. Thanks to Alexander the Great, the whole world speaks Greek. And when you go to a new area and you want to prove that Jesus is the Messiah, in the Greek translation, Messiah is always translated Christos. And so when you're a Christian, it's real easy to, it's right there, it's in the Greek, you know. Why do the nations rage against God's, well, in English, anointed one, Psalm 2. In Greek, why do the nations rage against his Christ? Well, you know, you're a Christian missionary, you just point right there. So it was very, very popular as a Christian missionary Bible. And as a result, there was sort of a Jewish pushing away from that translation and focusing more on the Hebrew. So I wonder if there might be something latent there when the paths diverged. But that would be pure speculation on that. But it does take us from the story of creation all the way to exile. So the creation of the universe all the way to the leaving of the land, that is thought of as the primary history. That's one long story. And that's something I did when I was in grad school. One of the assignments that we had was to read, I was taking a Pentateuch class, a Torah class, and our professor said, go home this weekend and read as much of the Pentateuch as you can at one sitting. Start in Genesis and go all the way to Deuteronomy as much as you can at one sitting. And it was really a great exercise for me because I had grown up in church, but as a result, I'd had sort of an episodic reading of the Bible, right? It was, here's Abraham, here's David, here's Noah, here's Moses, and to take a moment just to read it as story, I mean, it's probably what planted the seeds of me being a canonical scholar. I started really caring about that narrative. And so it is a story of creation to exile that finishes with Moses' death. And so one question I always ask the students, and this is one of those questions I really don't have a good answer for. I just ask this question for thought. I mean, what does it say? What does it mean that Pentateuch ends with Moses' death? I know for Von Rott it meant this can't be the end of the story. We got to add Joshua to the end of it. But it's I think an interesting question that you would finish with the death of Moses and a cliffhanger. Do you guys have any interpretive thoughts on that? I'd love to hear what you thought.
Post-exile as the generic answer to
Yes.
understanding, tell me when these things have all come together, and then I'll tell you why it makes the sense that it makes.
Well, I think I say that here. It is the first section of the canon to come together. The final editing likely in exile. Though I am very comfortable saying that there were earlier sources that are being reflected in that I do not believe Pentateuch was composed in exile. I believe it was edited in exile. Yeah, go ahead.
I think the question I really meant to ask was, in Christianity, we have a tradition of books that were not captured in the New Testament, and I think the line is they're supplemental, not heretical. That's, I think, a Catholic concept.
Well, they're not talking about Christian books in that.
Correct.
They're talking about Jewish
There
texts.
are books that the church early on said, this is not heresy, you can read them.
Right.
We're not capturing them as part of our formal New Testament.
Well, actually, I don't think they were that intentional about it. I think they thought of them as Old Testament, but it was only when it was only when St. Jerome looked at them, it was only when Martin Luther looked at them that people started going, should we really have these in here? They accepted them. There was no distinction. So I think that the additions to Esther, the additions to Daniel, Ecclesiasticus, Bel and the Dragon, all of those books were First Maccabees. Those were Old Testament as far as the first 400 years of the church, without question, and truthfully the first 1,400 years of the church. I mean, they were just accepted. That was just part of that canonical process. Because they were in the Septuagint. And that was the Old Testament for Christians. Now, no council ever approved them, and that was Jerome's point in about 4th century, and that was Martin Luther's point in the 14th century.
Well, another way of saying is, are there any books, any writings, I won't call them books, any writings that the Hebrews got together and talked about and said, no, we're not putting this in there?
Those exact ones.
That we know about.
Those books, the ones.
So they had an active conversation at the time. It wasn't just totally tradition.
Yes, it was an active conversation, but it wasn't an active conversation until 40 years after Jesus died. or 60 years after Jesus died.
Again, I'm talking.
But not ancient, no. In
I'm talking
exile,
Hebrew Bible.
no. That's what they were talking about. The Jewish councils were talking about the Hebrew Bible in about 90 AD. The Council of Jamnia came together and they were like, people are reading a lot of things, what should they read? And it was a question of not what we put in the Bible, it was a question of what should stay as part of our community's accepted practice. And that council approved what we as Protestants have as the 39 books of the Old Testament. And that's
Jews,
when...
not Christians.
These are Jews.
Okay.
Yes, in the Council of Jamnia, right. This is 60 years after Jesus, but it was the destruction of the temple that motivates this. Remember, canon is always motivated by crisis. Exile is what motivates the first one in the Old Testament. Destruction of the temple motivates it in the New Testament, at the New Testament period. And they said no. Maccabees no, which, by the way, creates one of the great ironies ever, because in the New Testament, Jesus is celebrating the Festival of Lights. The story of Hanukkah is told in the book of 1 Maccabees. As a result, the story of the origin of Hanukkah is only considered sacred scripture by Catholics, because those books were rejected by Jews and not used by Protestants. So history's weird. That's what that ends up saying. But anyway, yeah, so that was when that decision was made. We don't have any idea what was being considered an exile that has been lost to history as a result of that. In fact, this is when that's first coming together. Remember, prior to exile, you could apparently lose the book of Deuteronomy and no one would notice for a while until you find it when cleaning the temple. So yeah, you don't have, it's the crisis of exile that brings all of this together. And so that's always been my answer for the Moses question that I asked you, is that if this is coming together in exile, there's a sense of expectation. What is God going to do next? And leadership is now passing, and what's going to happen. I think that's the story they were trying to hold on to. I think that's why they preserved the Exodus story, because it was speaking to that same need of we need a new Exodus. We need a new Moses to lead us back. That's what Isaiah says, right? In the second part of Isaiah from 40 to 66. It's this new Exodus that God's going to do.
Well, and the other people that came after Moses, they were important and they were respected. But Moses was it.
We talk about Moses here. Yeah,
he was
that's right.
it. So maybe that had something to do with it too. Well, he's it.
He's
so,
it.
The rest of you can kind
makes
of...
a nice break point. Yeah, strong leadership goes. You have thoughts, Charlie?
I was just looking at my study Bible.
Oh.
It says it would
disagree with me?
No.
Oh, okay.
No.
That's okay.
It would answer the question.
Okay.
Why does the Pentateuch stop with Moses?
With Moses?
Because Moses wrote those books.
Well, yes, that's what they would say, isn't it? Did you guys peek at my notes before we did this? Because this is the next slide I'm going to deal with. Thank you so much. I appreciate you tag teaming so it doesn't look like just one of you doing this. But as Charlie points out, tradition has always ascribed the authorship of the Pentateuch to Moses. Yeah, and so that's why it finishes with Moses. And there is good interpretation. See, I told you, it's exactly that. I was literally about to get into this. Thank you. There are reasons for this. For one, you have other later Old Testament books that talk about the law of Moses and the books of Moses. Now, I should very quickly point out that we want to be very careful ascribing too much meaning to this particular preposition, because in Hebrew, the way that is done can mean by, as in written, of, but can also mean to or for or about, or it can be in honor of, there's a lot of range in that Hebrew phrase, so I don't want to push too much into the books of Moses means Moses wrote them. Now, that's the way that tradition has come out, but that is what they say. Books of Moses, Torah of Moses. New Testament books do exactly the same thing. These are two examples of that here. Moses does do some writing. God says to Moses, pick up a pen and then write these things down, and so he does. And it's really hard to break tradition. The traditional association of Moses with these books is so strong that when the King James Bible is translated, this is the first page. You might notice the title of the book is here.
Wow.
Okay.
Wow.
That is a pretty strong tradition that is going to...
Repeat what that source is again.
This is the first page of the King James Bible from the 1611 authorized version page right here.
Interesting.
Yeah. So that's why we have the first books of Moses, also called Genesis. Wait, what? What was that book called? Yeah. So this is page 1. So, you know, the King James is the most beloved translation in certainly Protestant Christian history, and so this is any of the tradition that was coming along is now set in concrete, right? That Moses is the one who has written these books, because they're going to ascribe authorship to Moses in these books. Now, there is some call. I've done this exercise once before with us on a Wednesday night, and I've done this exercise at the men's retreat, so this will be familiar to some of you. But there is some indication within the Pentateuch itself, within the text itself, that other hands are on the text that aren't named Moses, okay? Or certainly not the Moses we know. Genesis 12:6 has the phrase, "At that time the Canaanites were in the land." Now, the phrase, "at that time the Canaanites were in the land," only makes sense if it's being written at a time when the Canaanites are not in the land. Otherwise, as a marker, it doesn't help. And the Canaanites were in the land up until the time of David. So, I mean, it doesn't make sense for Moses to write at that time, because they were in the land when Moses was alive, so that doesn't make any sense. Same sort of thing here, Genesis 14, Abram went in pursuit as far as Dan. Dan is named Dan for the tribe of Dan, who hadn't taken the land at this point. The city of Dan is located in the tribe of Dan, named for the great-grandson of Abram, actually. So, I mean, this is an anachronistic reading backwards that would come even after Moses to use this as a marker, once again. So you get this kind of an anachronism. I've mentioned a couple times Moses was the humblest. Using your own third person is always, I didn't know Moses played for the NBA, but also saying you're the humblest person in the world, you don't get to do that. That's not cool, right? It's the old joke, I got an award for humility, but they took it away because I wore it. So it's a silly illustration, but again, just a point about the third person. Deuteronomy 1:1 we looked at. Moses spoke all these words in the plains of Moab, beyond the Jordan, sorry. This is the plains of Moab. You see Moses over there. You'll recognize him from his photographs, I'm sure. But here's the plains of Moab. He wrote the words of Deuteronomy beyond the Jordan. Here is the Jordan. So where is the person writing that sentence? Over here, right. So, because Moses was beyond the Jordan when he said all these words. So this, first of all, that's a third person, but also, why can't this be Moses? What? He didn't cross the Jordan, right? He didn't make it to the promised land. So the hands on that one certainly would have to be someone else's besides Moses on that one. And even not a prophet like Moses, since even the most conservative interpreters don't believe Moses wrote the part about his own funeral. Though I had a student who said, who argued with me on that. She was from a King James only church. Well, couldn't God have inspired him to write that if he wanted? Yes, he could have. I don't think God did, but yes, God could have. Most of the most conservative people don't believe Moses wrote his own. They always say Joshua wrote that part with no basis in the text, or they just pick Joshua as the one who writes that part. So.
Okay, so in that page from the King James.
Yes.
So then is Exodus.
Yeah, the second book of Moses, Exodus. Yeah, it's the same form. Yeah. So I mean, it's driven home. It's Moses is, like you said, he's like Moses.
First Moses, second Moses.
Yeah, first book of Moses, second book of Moses. Yeah, might as well call him the first Moses and second Moses. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So this is where people start getting a little twitchy. I mean, this was the first real problem I start having with my students in a semester, the ones who grew up in those King James only 1611 churches, although they could never read the 1611 King James if they tried, but we'll set that aside for just a minute. The first S and the second median S's are F's, and don't worry about it. Anyway, is composite authorship a problem for faith? This is a question that many of my students answer in the affirmative, because for them, it goes to authority. And that was always the question they brought up, that it had to be Moses, because if it's not Moses, then you don't trust it, right? You trust Moses as a speaker, you don't trust anything else. I never answered this question in the affirmative, because for me, I ultimately believe God is the author of the text. I believe God is the one who is inspiring the text. And if God is inspiring the text, it doesn't matter whose hand is on the pen at that point, or when they're putting it together, in exile or any other time, because I believe that's the one God is at work. So is authorship important? My answer to that is typically, well, yes, on some levels it is important. And one, that I do believe God is an ultimate author, but secondly, the human author's context is important for interpretation and having some sense of awareness of when that's coming in. So I think knowing that this is coming together in exile, for example, as a final editing, that gives us a sense of what they're wrestling with. Why these now? And I would argue that God is at work within that, but God is at work within that, I think, in a different way than other people would answer that question. God at work, being at work within that. So I'm telling you my perspective on this one. I am, on some levels, I am more assured by composite authorship. I don't like taking a single individual's word for something, a community's words for this. And the other part of this too is text just did not come together the way people envision text coming together. They don't come together today the way people envision text coming together. I mean, I'm still working on my book, finding the time on that. And I'm writing my book, and I send my book off to my editor, and my editor makes suggestions, and those suggestions come back, and I make some of those changes, and I don't make some of those changes. And once I finally get it done, it will go to an editing team of 3 who will make their suggestions that will then come back to me. That will then go to the layout editors, it will go to all these things, and any of whom could make substantive contributions to this book. And at the end of the day, up anywhere between 15 and 50 people could have had some impact in the shape of this text. My name's the only one that's going to be on it at the end of this. That's today, right? That's now when we think about this. It's not J.K. Rowling sitting in a coffee shop banging out Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone here. These books came together in community, even more so than mine is coming together in a very small community. These are coming together in community and being treasured and passed down and shaped in this and communally shaped as they go. The difference is I have no problem believing God's at work within that process, and some people do. And so that's where we disagree at the end of the day on that.
And not only in community, but over an extended period of time.
Exactly.
As well.
Long time, yeah. Now, I'm willing to give more credit to oral history and more authority to oral history than some people are. I think some people think oral history is a time when anybody can add anything, and I don't think that communities that focus on oral transmission truly are like that at all. But and usually I say that oral transmission is as reliable as the written transmission. And I think what people hear me say is, wow, oral transmission is really reliable. But what I'm really saying is, boy, written transmission is a little shaky between people sometimes. So, I mean, every major textual variant in the New Testament came in the first generation of the church, of the New Testament. Because the scribes were just, Christian scribes were lousy. Jewish scribes were great.
Rob,
Christian scribes were lousy.
is that question to you as an Old Testament scholar more important in the Old Testament than it is in the New? Because to me, I just take that as a given in the New Testament.
That it's composite?
Yeah.
Or that it's not?
That it is.
That it is composite.
Yeah.
That's interesting, because on some levels, like the letters of Paul would be more seamless
Sure.
at that point.
Sure, but you don't have just the letters.
No,
of
you
Paul.
don't. No, that's most of the book, but no. But on the other part of it is I don't think most people think of the New Testament that way, though, Ron, because even though technically all of the books of the New Testament, with the exception of Revelation and Paul's epistles, are anonymous. The Gospel of Matthew is called Matthew from church tradition. The Gospel of John, church tradition. Acts, the same way. There's no author given. Now you get John on Patmos in Revelation. James, Hebrews is anonymous. But I don't think people think of them as anonymous.
I definitely don't.
Yeah, people think of them as having an author.
Begs another question. The thing that's so remarkable about the Gospels, John, is you've got four,
Yep.
quote marks, four guys telling essentially the same story. And we spend 2,000 years saying, well, yeah, this guy's message was this gospel writer's message was that. But we don't really have that in the Hebrew tradition, do we? We don't have the same.
Kings and Chronicles is the one place you have that, where you've got some dovetailing. Now, Kings tells the story of the northern kingdom as well as the southern kingdom. Chronicles only tells the story of the southern kingdom, but there's overlap. And there is some information that's in Chronicles that's not in Kings, that's different. And a little bit of Samuel is told in Chronicles as well.
We have two perspectives, though.
You do have two perspectives, yes, very much. Now, I've borrowed the language of my colleague McKeever that I do the podcast with. He likes to say that we have 4 portraits of Jesus in the Gospels. He doesn't like 4 pictures. He said because you pay more for a portrait. And portraits are far more interpretive. And a portrait could be painted that doesn't necessarily represent exactly where you were at the time, but captures exactly who you are and really does tell your story. So he really loves the parable of portrait for the gospel for that very reason. that it's interpretive by its very essence.
But
Poetry is
just to follow that, he would interpret, and you would too, that they are different authors.
Yes.
Even if we're not sure who they are.
Absolutely.
Because they clearly paint differently.
Right, they do with different contexts, and that's the thing.
And
All of the
sometimes
Bibles,
they will catch the same oral quote or the
right,
details exactly the same.
and
But many times
sometimes
not.
they shade it differently,
Right.
and sometimes sometimes the same story is got two different meanings in two different gospels. The classic example is the temptation of Jesus, where in Matthew Jesus is tempted to turn the stones to bread, throw himself off the temple, or bow down and rule the kingdoms of the earth, which is the way we normally think of it, I think. Luke tells those same temptations. Turn stones to bread, that's the same, but he switches them. Bow down and get the nations of the earth, or jump off the temple. Well, so I was told the students about when they were talking about this, like, okay, well, you just tell me which gospel's right, so I don't have to read the other one then. Because their idea was, well, it has to be the same. And I was like, well, just tell me which one's right then, and we'll know. And the point is, the temple in Luke, and if you've been listening to the podcast, you probably picked up on this, the temple in Luke is vital for Luke Acts. The way the temple functions in that Luke Acts story is critical, I think, to understanding what's going on in that narrative, the volume 1 and volume 2 that's going on there. Mountains in Matthew are really important. The Sermon on the Mount, the eschatological discourse on the Mount, Transfigurations on the Mount, Jesus gives the Great Commission from the Mount. So you have same story, but different shadings, different portrait, because these guys are telling different stories about the nature of who Christ is. And I love the fact the church has always held on to that. The church has said, yeah, we want these 4 different portraits of Jesus. In the 2nd, 3rd century, there was some push to harmonize them. There's always a push to harmonize them. We tend to think of them harmonized, even if we don't realize it. And so there was a text called the Diatessaron that emerged. The Diatessaron, for those of you who know Greek, through the 4. And it was a smoothing of the story, right? It was a nice script that got rid of all of those nasty contradictions. So, in John, Jesus cleanses the temple at the beginning of his ministry. In the Synoptics, Jesus cleanses the temple at the end of his ministry. So in the Diatessaron, there's 2 cleansing of the temples, one at the beginning and one at the end. So there, see, no problems. And so it does those kinds of things. And the church rejected that. The church rejected the Diatessaron in favor of the 4 contrasting, I like that better than contradictory, contrasting portraits of Jesus, which is fascinating to me in all of this. So this issue of authorship, I think if your ultimate concern is God, I guess here's the thing. That's a statement of faith. That I believe God inspired the text is a statement of faith. And there's no way I can prove that to you. But somehow, if it's Moses, if it's Matthew, if it's Paul, that proves it for some people. They vest in them some certain special, and therefore see it's a faith statement. I believe that God has inspired this text. And at the end of the day, it doesn't matter the mechanism of it coming together. I believe God's at the root of that, however you want to understand that. So, which is fascinating, because we have the most boring origin story for our holy text of any of the major religions. I mean, all the other major religions have much sexier stories than we do. You've got the Quran coming together with the words being whispered by the angel into the ear of the Prophet Muhammad, and with Mormons get to find golden tablets with special goggles. That's a much cooler story. Why do we have the Bible? Well, we saved a guy's mail, and we thought it was really cool, so we wrote it down, and now it's the Bible. Wow, we saved Paul's mail. That's Paul wrote some letters. We liked some of them. We didn't like others of them. These seemed really special. We wrote them. We copied them. It became part of the biblical text. It's like, wow, what a boring story. God takes this incredibly ordinary event, and I believe does something extraordinary with it, which I think is a wonderful metaphor, because I kind of like to hope God can do that with me too.
Christians and Christian scholars
Yes.
had spent a long time trying to hunt any reference in antiquity texts to early Christians, and
Sure.
we're familiar with the
Crestus and all the rest, yeah.
Is it really a similar problem with the Old Testament? Are we reduced really to the great Ramses stele where he says and the power are no more? How would you characterize a collection of independent references to the Hebrews in antiquity up to
To the 13th century, yeah. The first real extra biblical mention of Israel is on what's called the Merneptah Stele, who is the son of Ramses II. He references several kingdoms, or several kingdoms in Canaan. And at that point, Israel is mentioned, but they use the iconography that indicates an ethnicity, not a nation, indicating they seem to be a tribal kind of group, not a city-state kind of organized, not Ammon, not Moab, not the Philistines, but that. That's the first reference of them. That you can say, yes, this is who we're talking about. Are the Habiru from 200 years before that connected in some way? Maybe. I think that the Habiru's connection with the city of Shechem and Israel not destroying Shechem when they go into the Promised Land, they destroy Jericho, they destroy Ai, they go to Shechem and have a revival service, which is an odd thing to do when you've just been told by God to kill everyone in the nation, to go to Shechem and have a revival service. But they have a revival service, them and it says the aliens who were among them. Well, that makes me awfully suspicious about why Shechem there was some recognition of Yahweh that just seems to exist, and the Bible didn't have a problem with it. So that's suspect. Israel for sure, 13th century. David and Solomon, nothing from that time period. About 100 years after what we would normally date for David, you do have the House of David inscription that's found in northern Israel that does refer to Judah, so there's at least some recognition there was a historical person named David.
There was a program on last week, I was just flipping channels, and a British scholar, a woman,
do you know the name?
was,
I'm sorry.
A younger woman, and was challenging the iconography of David.
Oh, okay.
It was that school, and
Sure.
My question was, is this kind of a radical offshoot that David
No.
is a composite character?
No.
Or is there's serious scholars
There
who
is.
say that he was a composite?
There is. I mean, the one struggle here is that, here is both David and Solomon, you would argue, two of the most iconic figures in the monarchy, and absolutely no material culture that supports their existence, except from the contemporaneous material culture that supports their existence. You do get the House of David inscription that comes a little bit later, 100 years, within 100 years later. But this is one of those times where there's just silence on the subject. There does seem to be building and material culture that supports a national identity from that time period, but no inscriptions, no pictures. You wouldn't have pictures. Israelites didn't make statues like Egyptians did, probably because of the commandments that they had in their tradition. So I have no problem believing that we have a historical David and a historical Solomon. But I also don't get too caught up in that either. It doesn't.
Well, part of her argument was that the contemporary birth of the David cult, if you will, came from the first Israeli state scientist who was also conveniently, I think, defense minister.
Yigal Yadin?
State archaeologist.
Yeah, Yigal Yadin.
And it was convenient to the early Israelis in the 50s to lionize David and to establish.
Yeah, Yadin was by no means the first. I mean, he's going to pick up on that without question. But, I mean, I would have to say, frankly, that you have to give credit to someone like W.F. Albright, who's an American, who actually was Tom Jackson's professor at Johns Hopkins, by the way. We had a good... Tom came and hung out in the office for, 3 hours, and he will let you get a word in if you give him enough time. He's just got to tire himself out, and then you get to talk to him. But we had a great conversation, Tom and I did, and he got to talk about W.F. Albright. Albright was the one who really sort of began that I mean, he's been called the father of biblical archaeology, but what he has done is used archaeology apologetically. And he would be one of the ones I would give credit for arguing that kind of historicity needs to happen or cause all of this into sort of chaos. And so yeah, that's what, yes, ma'am.
Rob, if I heard you correctly, you said that the books of the Bible are anonymous.
The New Testament.
The New Testament.
Most of the New Testament are anonymous.
Just the New Testament.
Most of the Old Testament is anonymous too. The words of Amos, the words of Isaiah, the words of Jeremiah, almost universally believed to be preserved orally, which is probably why they were written in poetry, and then written down by later followers of the prophet, schools of the prophet.
Therefore, there must have been a lot of controversy over the years.
Yeah,
Can you
maybe.
tell me which books have had the most controversy?
Yeah, in the Old Testament, Esther had a hard time making the cut.
And who do they believe wrote it?
Well, Esther had a hard time making the cut because it doesn't talk about God. It wasn't the authorship was not the primary motivation for getting rid of it. In fact, it was the lack of mention of God, the celebration of a non-Mosaic holiday. They celebrate Purim, which is not in the Torah. And the heroine, Esther, is named after the Babylonian goddess Ishtar. And Mordecai's name is Marduk, who is a Babylonian god. And so people were like, are we really, I don't think this is a book we want to necessarily keep. It's written in Aramaic. It's not even written in Hebrew. Parts of it are written in Aramaic. And so there was a lot of tension, but popular use of the book pushed its usage and inclusion in the canon. Song of Songs was its explicit celebration of human sexuality. It was on the fence, but again, there was a groundswell to keep it in. In the New Testament, Revelation had a hard time making the cut. Jude and 2 Peter had a hard time making the cut. If I got 2 essays as a professor written by as closely as Jude and 2 Peter were, I'd have them in my office. I mean, they were folks sitting a little too close together in prophet class because there's an awful lot of similarities in those two stories. Hebrews had a hard time making the cut. But what happened was, and this is one of those things I love, is that there's no standard of rule that I could tell you and give you to say, this is what makes a book go in the Bible, this is what makes sure a book goes out of the Bible. Because there are books that you would think would be fine. Paul apparently wrote a letter to the Laodiceans. Paul apparently wrote an earlier letter to the Corinthians than 1 Corinthians, because he references it in 1 Corinthians 5:9. And they're not in the Bible. And so Paul wrote it, it's the right time. I trust Paul to be orthodox. I trust Paul to, but it's not in the text. And then you get something like Esther, which on the surface has no reason to be in the Bible. And yet there is something about this book that speaks to people. There's something about, and this is the part I love, there is something about the inspiration of God that works sometimes against common sense and scientific understanding. You just don't put God in a box sometimes. There seems to be something special about this book, even though you wouldn't think it is. It doesn't fit the mold. It goes in the text. Revelation's the same way. So there were a lot of, authorship was, traditional authorship ascription was important, but it wasn't the number one thing that made a book go in the Bible, which has always been fascinating to me. So this is actually starting the conversation I thought it might. Yeah, see?
Well, under the theory of inspiration that you presented earlier,
Yes.
it seems like there's kind of an ironic situation here that we have human beings determining which books are inspired enough by God.
Trying to determine that, but yes, because I presented it to Steve as though they were making the decisions. I recognize that. The reality was they were rubber stamping decisions that communities were already making.
Well, so do you think there are any books that were inspired by God that did not make it into the...
I would probably have to read the end of John chapter 20 and answer that question and say yes. That sense that we could say more. There were more stories we could tell about Jesus. There were more traditions we could tell about this.
No, I mean
but
the ones that were actually rejected.
These are written... No, I don't think the ones we know about
were inspired by God in any way, shape, or form.
Well, I think... how about this? I think some of them could be scriptural, but I wouldn't consider them scripture. As a Protestant, I love the prayer of Manasseh in the Apocrypha. And the book of Ecclesiasticus, or the Wisdom of Jesus ben Sirach, is hysterical. It's just so funny. It's a Proverbs book, but some of the Proverbs are just, one of those, my heart longs for wisdom like a eunuch who holds a woman and groans. It's that kind of, or whoever tries to teach a fool wastes their time, wakes a slumbering man. At the end, they'll just look at you and say, what is it? Little things like that. So, I find some of them to be scriptural in the same way that I would find the writings of, Rachel Held Evans, to pick someone who tragically passed away this week. I think some of those things that she wrote are scriptural, but I would never consider them scripture.
There are no other writings that exist are inspired by God, except the ones that are in the.
I would say that they are that many things are inspired by God. I do think that I would privilege these texts in a way that I wouldn't privilege others, because of their longevity, because of their message, because of there's something special about these. I think that artists can be inspired by God of all sorts, absolutely. I think we have a challenge to be inspired. I mean, technically the word inspire means to be God-breathed. I think that, that inspiration is, without question, something that God does. But I do think that, I do privilege these 66.
For example, it's hard to imagine that any of Paul's letters were not inspired by God, whether they made it into the text or not.
Well, yeah, that's one.
So
You could say,
there are
right.
certainly a few of those out there.
Yeah, I love the end of, and I'm going to go ahead and give Paul the benefit of the doubt on Colossians, although it's one of the disputed letters. But at the end of the book of Colossians, he says, make sure and read my letter to the Laodiceans. So I always joke with the students that apparently Paul thought a lot of the letter to the Laodiceans. God apparently didn't, because it didn't make the cut. So we don't have that one. So it's, 1 Corinthians 5:9 says, in my earlier letter I wrote to you. That'd be really nice to have, but for whatever reason. So that's where at the end of the day I said that end of John 20. This is written so that we might believe. This is enough so that we might believe. I think that's how I am on this. Can we have more? Yeah, I'd like to have more. I'd like to know what happened to the church in the East. All we have in the book of Acts is how the church went west. We know Christians went east. It'd really be interesting to see what happens. I'd like to know that story. I don't have that story. Nobody took the time on that story. So, it's just one of those things. Anything else? This is a good conversation to have, and we don't talk about it enough.
You still like this?
What's that?
Still like this conversation?
I do. You want to keep asking?
So to Steve's question.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question.
It is, absolutely.
So a parallel question for me is, okay, so which ones are the most important text and chapters of the Bible? And I don't expect you to answer that, but I think that's something that all of us have to think hard about and ask ourselves how they inspire us or what we understand from them as priority. Because as a whole, most Christians, most believers don't have the capacity to understand the canons as you do. But we all have to struggle with that. Well, what's the most important messages here?
I would say, and you know what? I probably need to think about this more, because I don't have a problem privileging some of the texts over other texts. And I don't know how much I want to go crazy with that. But I do want to say, I always want to keep in mind, and I guess the caution on that is I want to keep in mind what James Sanders said, and you've heard me quote many times, that the canon is self-correcting. Right? The Bible is very good at keeping you from taking it out of context if you read all of it. So when you have Genesis 1, you also have Genesis 2. So you have a transcendent picture of God and an immanent picture of God. When you have Amos, this very objective God who is the outside consultant who has come in to evaluate the problem here, you also have Hosea, who is talking about the same people but doing it from an act of compassion and heartbroken, because both are true. Both fair, it's both objective and fair and tearing God up inside. So I want to be careful on that, but I don't really like Proverbs that much. I've seen it misused too many times, and it's been trouble. It troubles me, and I think that Job and Ecclesiastes are there to help people from taking Proverbs too far. But that probably means I need to read Proverbs to keep me from taking Job and Ecclesiastes too far at the same time. I absolutely despise the book of Nahum. I used to despise the book of Nahum. Now I just don't like it. I'm getting better. Nahum and I are coming to an understanding. But it troubles me. But here's the other thing. It's still in the text. And I still teach it. I've still preached from it. I still will wrestle with it. If we do a prophet series in the fall, I'll talk about it. I won't like it. But I'll talk about it. Because for me, canon is so important. Because canon is what governs inspiration. The decision about is it inspired or not has already been made that's above our pay grade. We don't have to decide should we be reading or shouldn't we be reading. I want to print a Bible with skiing marks next to it, so we know that we can keep people on bunny slopes away from double black diamond passages like Romans and other places, Leviticus and some things that people misuse. But it's all canon, so it's inspired. So I want to.
Well, and I guess just to make sure I leave the point correct the way I really meant it, I don't mean to say I choose to prioritize Matthew and not Acts,
right,
or Esther and not.
Right.
I really meant to say, how we go about interpreting and prioritizing what we believe from all of it.
Yeah.
And try to put that in our minds and be able to communicate that priority of what we have concluded from that. Because that's many underlines, isn't it? In many parts of the Bible. It's not just picking certain chapters.
And I think for me it's important to have all of that governed by the double love principle. In other words, that love of God and love of neighbor is the glasses through which I need to be reading all of this. And if the interpretation is not teaching that in my mind, then somebody's culture is getting in the way. Because I believe that is the character of Yahweh, I believe that is the character of Jesus, I believe they're both the same. And so for me, that needs to be the glasses through which I'm reading this. And that's why I struggle with Nahum, because that's the place that is the only place I haven't found a really good way to wrestle with those goggles much. So, I mean, Luther wanted to get rid of James. I'm fine with James. I have no problems with James. I got problems with Nahum. So, yes.
By your comments about Proverbs,
Yes.
are you indicating that to many people Proverbs is one of the best books? Because I've read somewhere, I'm not sure whether in guideposts or somewhere else, that for wisdom it is a good place to start.
And
for inspiration
it is
as well.
It is. And if you have an understanding of the genre of wisdom, it's great. The problem that I run into, and it was with students a lot, but I think also other readers of the text, are those who don't read Proverbs as wisdom, they read them as Torah. In other words, my previous church, train up a child in the way he will go, and when he's older, he won't depart from it. I saw that. Now, what that means in wisdom literature is, it is better to be a good parent than it is to be a bad parent. If you want to give your child the best chance to succeed in this world, be a good parent. Now, we all know good kids from bad homes and are miraculously understand how in the world could they have turned out of that terrible situation. We've all seen that. But that's the exception. Usually, bad home situation, bad home life, you see someone on a track for bad. And Proverbs comes along and says, look, you train up a child in the way they will go. When it's older, they won't depart. That's be a good parent. It's the best chance to give them success. I was in a church setting where I heard someone confront someone else and judge their parenting because a child had gotten off the track and had become an alcoholic. And they felt guilt as a parent. What did I do wrong? And then that was being fed by this community. And I said, no. I mean, it's not Torah. It is not saying, this is not a guarantee. This is wisdom literature. This is look before you leap, and he who hesitates is lost. That says two opposite things. The wisdom is knowing when it is you play it safe and when it is you take your chance. Proverbs 26 verse 4, don't answer a fool according to their folly, or you will be like them. Verse 5, answer a fool according to their folly, or they'll be wise in their own eyes. Back to back, the Proverbs say exactly opposite things. They contradict us. That's fine. It's wisdom literature. Our own wisdom tradition contradicts itself, right? But in the Torah, you don't get thou shalt not commit adultery. Well, that's not, you don't do that. And so Proverbs has been used as Torah, and that's where I've pushed back against it. But in fairness, like any pendulum, I probably swang too far. And I probably need to come back a little bit and keep Joshua, or keep Job and Ecclesiastes and hold that in hand with Proverbs as well. So it's not used as Torah, but used as wisdom literature, instructions for how to live well, how to, and so that's been my struggle with Proverbs. I still preach and teach from it too, whether I like it or not. So make myself do these things because it's canon, and I'm a canonical guy. I got to take that seriously. So good questions. Couple of other thoughts. People have talked about the theological center of the Torah. So we're back to Genesis to Deuteronomy. And I wanted to give you sort of some classic themes. So as you're looking at Genesis to Deuteronomy, some of these themes may emerge for you, and it may come back to mind for you as you go through this. Covenant is probably 86% of the biblical scholars out there. When they look at Torah, they think it's all about covenant, that you choose a special people for a special relationship through which you're going to save the rest of the world, and that's the whole theological center. Probably the most famous Old Testament theologian to espouse this, Walter Eichrodt, put his Old Testament theology volumes 1 and 2 together, and this was his point. I mean, that was in the 1920s, 1930s, I think, that came out. And that was and pretty much everybody after that. Yeah, you know what? Covenant. That's about right. Covenant is probably exactly the center. In the 70s, creation became a very popular theological center. And that the story of God creating, humanity corrupting, God recreating. That this cycle happens over and over again. And that covenant would be put in the how God recreate part. So where Eichrodt would have seen creation as part of covenant, here creation sees covenant as part of the creation theology. That this is a theme that you get over and over again, that God will create this place, humanity screws up this place, God has to then come in and try to fix it, and that is one that happens over and over again. 1970s, as I said, was pretty the popular time for that to come out. It's still around.
When you say that, are you referring to Christians or Jews or everyone? What happened in the 70s?
Biblical scholars. So most of whom Christian, okay. But the guild as a whole, people who looked at these texts, okay. That was what they went with. Heilsgeschichte, salvation history, was incredibly, probably in the 50s, but it really was almost a little bit of both. It's a shame that it predated creation because it tried to do both things. That covenant and creation are part of this larger story of God's interacting with and saving humanity / Israel. So Israel is the means by which that salvation comes, and God is also in the process of saving them as well. Gerhard von Rad, the name I gave you at the beginning, he was a major proponent of Heilsgeschichte. He was German, so it's always Heilsgeschichte. I can't see that without... I got that wrong on a German test. That's why I keep saying it to myself. You know how the question you miss is the one you remember forever? You don't remember anything you got right. Heilsgeschichte, salvation history, in case you didn't know that. I almost wrote it in German just because. David Klein's, British scholar, still alive today. I like his theological center. Partial fulfillment for him is the center. That the story is about God covenanting, yes, but only partially meeting that all throughout the story. That Abraham is selected, and when Abraham dies, he has a son, but he doesn't see the nation. And when Jacob dies in Genesis, he has 70, not quite a nation, but you do have, but you're in Egypt, so that's not quite it either. You get to the end of Deuteronomy, you've got a nation now, we've got a vast people, but you're in Deuteronomy, you're over in the plains of Moab, you don't have the nation. So the story is sort of God moving you on in this series of fulfillment and unfulfillment as it goes, that it's a journey, if you will. That probably gets closest to a Jewish reading of the Hebrew Bible. Ultimately, Revelation kind of has us moving toward eschaton and eschatology and the end. I don't know that that's the best way to read that. I kind of have a very Jewish reading of our story, I suppose. Probably that's an occupational hazard when you're an Old Testament guy. But typically, the Jewish reading of the Hebrew Bible would be that the ultimate goal is return, is home. I mean, that's the way 2 Chronicles ends. That's the way that, and so that sort of cycle of return, that desire for return, this is probably closest to that, where it's a journey of God dealing with each generation and the goal being hopefully home, finding home. Amy Jill Levine says that Christianity is more like football, where the goal is to move forward toward the end zone, and Judaism is more like baseball, where the goal is to get home, is to come back around and return. And so, not a bad parable, I think, in the readings on that. I would argue, I actually probably read the Christian story more like baseball, I think. And that's a spoiler for the Memorial Day sermon, because we're doing a series. The lectionary's in Revelation right now, and so I'm not missing a chance to preach it. So we're in Revelation this Sunday, and we're in Revelation on the 26th. And the 26th is the end of the story, and it looks like the coming back home to me. So we'll talk about that. So spoilers. See, this is what you get. You get the advanced sermon view before you come on the 26th. But anyway.
That's how we know these slides before you put the next
That must be it. I don't know. It's crazy.
You just forgot. You've already
Must
told
be
us.
it. Well, don't do that to me. I'm having enough of this. One thing that I think is interesting in considering, and we've just got a couple of minutes left, but Torah is sacred scripture, and we've already mentioned for Christians, yes, and Jews also, but I think it's worth mentioning, it's the entire canon for the Sadducees in the New Testament period. That is the Bible. The Sadducees did not recognize any of the prophetic writings as scripture. They did not recognize any of the writings as scripture. Psalms is not scripture for Sadducees. And the Samaritans agreed with that. It was the entire canon of scripture for Samaritans as well. So I think sometimes we have this tendency to sort of think monolithically about Jewish belief and ideas, but it's incredibly diverse today, and it was incredibly diverse in the first century. Torah was it. So this is part of the thing, and I don't think we had this reading in Holy Week this week, it was last year, but some Sadducees came to Jesus to ask him a question about resurrection, which Jesus pointed out, well, you don't even believe in resurrection. It's not in the Torah. So, but interestingly enough, when Jesus talks to the Sadducees about resurrection, he uses a passage from Exodus. He doesn't use Daniel, which is great, or Ezekiel, which would have been great. He uses Exodus because that was their sake. He used their book to show them that they needed to think about, which I just think is interesting. It is part of the canon for Pharisees, for Essenes, for Christians. The Pharisees and the Essenes had what we consider Old Testament, 39 books each. Christians, Protestants, 39 books. For Catholics, it's 46, but still part of the Torah on that. I will say this, though it's only part of the canon in Jewish thought, for the Pharisees and the Essenes, it does have special priority in a way that was kind of what we were talking about. Torah is more important on some level in Jewish tradition than Esther. Esther is Jewish readings of Scripture are always in community and always disputational, and so they've had 3,000 years of interpreting and arguing about that, and so the argument and the interpretation soon becomes important in that conversation as well. Mishnah, Talmud also is part of this conversation. But it's always coming back to Torah. It's how Esther reflects Torah. It's how the prophets are not concerned with Torah. Or the people aren't in the prophets concerned with Torah. It's Torah special in the view of this. So that's why I kind of wanted to slow up this week and just take a minute to kind of look at our 30,000-foot view of Torah as we go. So questions, comments, thoughts? All right. I think we'll do Joshua next week. We'll see. I may come up with something else. But we'll keep moving forward. So have a great week, and I'll see you Sunday. Enjoy choir practice or handbells, whichever you're here for.
I know you got it all.
Sure he did.
I'm counting on him to get it all every time.
Thank you, always fascinating.
No, I hope so.
I'm just thankful there's no tests at the end.
Are you sure? I think